Hello everyone, my name is Pastor John and I'm really excited to get into Daniel chapter 6 with you today. This is one of the most famous stories in the whole Bible, the story where Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den, where God comes in, he shuts the lion's mouth, and he rescues Daniel through a whole night sleeping with these wild beasts. And time again, as I've been reading through the book of Daniel the past several weeks, I am just amazed by the faith of these men in the Old Testament. Whether it's Daniel having faith to stand up against the government, or Nebuchadnezzar, or Belshazzar, and all these, and as well as his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And sometimes I just wonder if I were to be in their position, if I were to have to stand against all these odds, to the threat of death by these terrible means, whether it's being burned in the fiery furnace, whether it's being thrown into the lion's den, whether it's just being in general persecuted in this way, would I have the faith to stand through it? And that's just a question that I always ask myself. Where is my faith? How strong is my faith? Do I really trust in God? And once again, in Daniel chapter 6, it's going to encourage us to trust God, because God is in control. God has authority over our circumstance. And there's a couple things that I really took away to begin with as I look at this chapter. And the first is just, once again, God's sovereign protection, that God is in control no matter what is going on, no matter what's happening, no matter what odds we're against. God has this all figured out. God has a plan, and God has the ability to rescue us. And once again, God places the leaders in our life, and our government, and our officials, and the kings and nations over us. And God is in control, and that nothing else and nothing happens apart from God. God is aware of everything that happens, and God is always in control. And the second thing that I really took away from this is that no matter how perfectly we follow the Lord, there is always going to be persecution. And I would even say that the better we follow God, the more persecution that's going to come on our life. And as we look at Daniel's life here, and we're going to see that there's going to be some spies, and this kind of this dirty politics is really what it comes down to. And they begin to spy on Daniel, and they find him completely faultless. But the thing they find, his only fault that they could kind of pinpoint, comes from his religion, that he was so devoted to following the God of the universe, the God who spoke the world into existence, the God of Israel, that they could trick him, that they could kind of swindle a law passed that would require Daniel to either choose to follow his God or worship the king. And we're going to see this all unfold today. So as we open up to Daniel chapter 6, we find that we are in the last section of what is called the narrative. So the first 6 chapters are really narrative based. We kind of see a story flowing through it. It's really easy to follow. But the chapters following, beginning in chapter 7, we're going to be looking at the recordings of Daniel's dreams and visions. So we're going to be starting that next week, but we're finishing up the first 6 chapters today. And once again, we're seeing Daniel in the lion's den, and this is one of the most, though it's one of the most famous stories in the Bible, it's also one of the most kind of misrepresented. See, in the beginning of Daniel chapter 1, we see Daniel being brought as a young teenager. He was about 15 years old, and he's brought to Babylon to learn and study, and kind of they're going to groom him to be kind of one of their nation's leaders, the wise men, the people that would be in charge of interpreting dreams and whatnot. And this was in about 605 BC, and Daniel was 15 years at this point. So over that time, coming down to Daniel chapter 6, a lot of time has passed to the point that Daniel is now 82 years old. We believe that Daniel chapter 6 happened during the year of the Medo-Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BC. And what so often happens whenever we see this, and it's normally children's stories and plays and things like that, Daniel is represented as a teenager when in fact he's actually 82 years old. He's actually an old man at this point, and that really kind of gives us a bigger picture versus, throwing a teenager into a hole of lions versus throwing an old man into the hole of lions. So this kind of shapes up our perception of what is actually happening here. So I just want to jump into it to Daniel chapter 6, verse 1 through 3, which says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one of whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." So at this time, Darius began to organize this newly conquered Babylonian territory. You can imagine, you go in, you take over a new nation, and now you have to begin setting up a government, setting up a kind of a structure. And this is really important, mainly because Darius wanted to collect his taxes. He wanted to get what he was owed. And the only way to do this is have people in charge, have a governing body over them, because people are not just going to deliver their taxes to you freely by their own will and their own power. They're not, people are just not honest enough. We need a governing body to make sure this happens. And this is exactly what Darius is doing. So he decides to put 120 satraps, is what the word is. But really it's just, it's essentially lower tier local government officials. So he puts 120 lower officials over the whole region. Each official takes a certain area. And over these 120 satraps, there's going to be 3 leaders that are in charge of them. Because any good government has different levels of government. In America, we have president, vice president, we have congressmen, we have House of Representatives, we have mayors, we have local governors, and so forth. All having a different amount of power and a different amount of authority. So of these 3 kind of officials that he put over the 120, Daniel was one of the ones chose. So we see that even in this new Persian government that was coming in, Daniel quickly rises to prominence and has authority even in this new governing body, new structure here. And we see that Daniel was put in this position because he had an excellent spirit was in him. And kind of whenever we hear this, an excellent spirit was in him, that's kind of a strange way of saying it for us today. But really what that comes down to is that, either Daniel had just some great wisdom and insight and knowledge. We see that from earlier chapters in the book of Daniel. We see that he is faithful and reliable. That's really kind of evident in the way that he treats Nebuchadnezzar versus the way that he treats Belshazzar. When he sees someone who has authority, who God has clearly put in place to be a strong leader, Daniel really pours into that. He really acknowledges that and is faithful. Though he is faithful to God first and above all else, he definitely is faithful to his leaders. It also can mean that he just, by this time, had shown some excellent administration skills, some wise leadership. I think that's very evident in the previous chapters as well. And then finally, his knowledge of God and knowledge of the human nature really separated him from the rest. And we can see this in the way that he interpreted the dreams, the way that he presented himself before the kings. He was someone that was quickly identified as someone who could really lead the kingdom. And then we get to Daniel chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, which says, "Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for compliment or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, 'We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of God.' Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into a den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and assign the government so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and the injunction. So we find out that the king's choice of Daniel to be in such a high position really created some jealousy among the other court officials. They really wished to denounce Daniel in his position. They wanted to get rid of him. And this is any politics, really. Even today, we see different leaders kind of going at one another, especially in our politics here in America. You know, Republicans versus Democrats. We just see threats and all sorts of things. This man isn't qualified, blah, 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 blah. It's just a big mess. And this is exactly what is happening here. But since Daniel was both diligent and honest in his work, no corruption could be found in him. And we see that he's really exemplifying the message of Titus chapter 2, verse 7 through 8, which says, show yourself in all respect to be a model of good works, and in your teaching show integrity, dignity, and sound speech that cannot be condemned, so that an opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say about us. So we see that they go in and they spy on Daniel. They're trying to find dirt in his life, but they've come up empty-handed. They have nothing evil to say about him. And because they've begun to seek a way to find him and they find nothing, they then decide, guess what, we're not going to find any hard evidence that Daniel is deserving of being demoted or deserving of losing his position, so we're going to try to trap him. And they begin to just look for vulnerabilities. And what ends up being found is that Daniel's only vulnerability is his religion. He is so devoted to serving God that the only way that they could trap him is to say, guess what, Daniel, there's a law that says for this amount of time you cannot serve your God. Instead, you have to serve and worship the king. And they knew this was the only way that they could possibly remove Daniel. And when the officials approached the king with this idea, they knew that they were not going to be able to get the king's approval if not every governing official was on board. So they end up lying to the king by saying in verse 7, all of the officials in the government agreed on this new law. They said, hey king, you are so great, so mighty. We want to pay homage to you. We want to show our support. Everyone's in agreement here. We're ready to worship you. Just, you deserve this worship. You deserve everything. And they propose that for 30 days, the whole kingdom could only worship, could only give petition, and could only give praise and pray to the king. No one could worship any god besides King Darius for this time period that was 30 days. And now, for most of the polytheistic religious people and idol worshippers at this time, this really wasn't seen as a big deal. They're just going to have to worship one god for 30 days, and they'll go back to worshiping the other gods. Because, really, if you think about it, if you're able to worship multiple gods, that means they don't really serve jealous gods. If you kind of think about it, their gods are more than willing or more than okay with their people worshiping other gods at different times. And that's really what separates the God of the Bible from these other pagan gods, is that the God of the Bible is a jealous God. He wants our full and kind of narrow support. He doesn't want us serving anybody else. He wants us to acknowledge that God of the Bible is God alone. And when it comes, let's go back to Darius. At this time, Darius was probably flattered by this proposal, and even though he probably hadn't really made a claim to deity at this point, it probably wasn't something that he ever did. But, you know, if people are going to worship you, why not? At the most, he probably likely had adopted some form of like a role of priestly mediator, but he wasn't someone like Nebuchadnezzar who was kind of seeking this for himself. And really what this kind of 30 days really represented to Darius was a way to unite this new conquered land under the new Persian Empire. And one way to do this is to unite them in worship. We find that I think this is one aspect of churches. Why are churches so close-knitted, or why are we supposed to be so close-knitted, if we put it that way? I think it's because we have a commonality in worshiping one God. And when we see a nation who is coming together to worship one God, they are going to be closer because of this. And because of all these benefits, whether it's bringing the kingdom together, whether it's getting kind of his own self-praise, Darius agrees to this petition and proposal and signs it into law. And remember that Darius at this time believed that all of his officials are on board. There's no going to be a rebellion. No one's going to be standing up against him. Everyone is for this. This is all going to work great. Everything's going to be sunshine and roses. And really, there's no big deal about abandoning one God for 30 days, because you can just go back to him afterwards. And where this problem comes in is at the time that the decree goes out, it cannot be changed. The king cannot write up a law to challenge the first law. So once a law is in place, it is not changing. There is no other way. It is final. And we see this also in the book of Esther, where Haman convinces the king to declare that the people could go and persecute and kill the Jews. And then Esther kind of shows up and says, "Hey, I'm a Jew. Why are you wanting to kill me?" And the king gets angry, but he can't change the first law, so he has to make a new law to combat the first law, if that makes sense. So going back to Esther chapter 8, verse 8, it says, "But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." So, going back to the story of Esther, because it was sent out in final, the king in Esther had to send out a separate edict to combat the first one in Esther chapter 8, verses 10 through 11. And the first edict was allowing people to go and torture and kill the Jews. The second edict allowed the Jews to defend themselves. And basically, what happened in Esther is a civil war erupted because of this. So this is a big deal. Once you sign a law into place, you're not going to get rid of it. You're not going to change it. It is there for all eternity. And what's actually been seen here is that in the minds of this, how this structure worked, it was better to have a civil war than to erase or nullify a original decree. And jumping over to Daniel chapter 6, verse 10 through 13, it says, "When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went up to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, 'O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition, any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?' The king answered and said, 'The thing stands fast, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked.' Then they answered and said before the king, 'Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day.'" So even though the law had gone out prohibiting prayer to anyone besides Darius, Daniel continues to press forward, open his window for all to see, open it towards Jerusalem, and continues to pray to God. See, during this time, the Jewish people who were in exile, the temple has been destroyed. They would open up their window and they would pray towards Jerusalem. And even today, many Jews will follow this, as modern Jews will face Jerusalem to pray towards their holy temple, the Holy Land. So this is a common thing today, and it was a common thing back then. And this was done just as Solomon had instructed in his prayer of dedication for the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 44, which says, "If your people go out to battle against their enemy, by whatever way you shall send them, and they pray to the Lord towards the city that you have chosen, and the house that I have built for your name." And that city was Jerusalem, where the original and subsequent temples had been built in the same place. So Daniel here, we have to remember, Daniel was not praying out of rebellion towards the king, but out of obedience to the greater command of God. And this we see is the same thing that the apostles later say in Acts chapter 5 verse 29, which says, "But Peter and the apostles answered, 'We must obey God rather than man.'" And what's amazing about how great the reputation of Daniel's commitment to God was, or the Lord was, is that Daniel had such a strong reputation that even his enemies, even the ones who were against him, who didn't like him, even his enemies knew that he would rather obey God rather than follow the law and bow down to the king. And really what we learn from Daniel's prayer life is that for Daniel, prayer was a necessity. He prayed regularly. He needed to pray. It was his lifeblood. It allowed him to live with faith. It allowed him to have a strong faith in God. It allowed him to wake up and pursue the things that God had for him that day. We also learned that even under difficult circumstances, Daniel turned to God in prayer and had faith that God could save him. For Daniel, it was more important to pray than to live. He was willing to suffer and die rather than revoke his right to pray to his God. Daniel's prayer consists of petition, praise, thanksgiving, confession of sin, and intercession. He experienced this marvelous fulfillment from his prayer. He understood the benefits that came from it outweighed the negatives. And in spite of his many duties and all the stress that had come from his position in life, remember, he had authority. He was one of the top 3 men of this whole region. It earlier says that there was a chance that he was going to be made the primary head, or even over the 3. But even though all the busyness of life, he still took time for prayer. And prayer may have actually been the key to his success. And I believe that is true, because with this prayer, he proved to God his obedience, and he understood God's word and that God would be faithful to save him. You know, Daniel regularly prayed and retreated to a special place at a specific time. He made prayer a discipline in his life, and I think that's something we need to model for our own lives as well. And, you know, there's a question that we can ask is, why did Daniel continue to pray in such a way that he could be seen? Because we all know that he could have gone and hid in private. He could have hid and just kind of let this whole thing blow over. He could have changed the times that he had prayed every day to kind of mess up his spies and his kind of enemies. But he continues to pray the exact same time openly for the world to see, in spite of knowing that this action was going to lead to his potential demise. I think a couple of potential answers we could have here is that it would have been a denial of his faith not to continue to pray in this way as he did before. He understood that his faith was important to God and that God desired this and God commanded this. It also would have recognized the king as the highest authority over the Lord. If he would stop praying to the Lord because the king said so, he understood that God was in charge. God was the head of all authority over the world, and he was not going to belittle God and serve the king above him. his connection with God was so important to him, especially in crisis. He had seen that his connection with God had saved himself as well as his friends before. He was not going to give that up, even for 30 days. And finally, once again, a secret refusal to obey orders would still have been a refusal to obey the orders of God. And he realized that in reality he had nothing to hide. God was in control. What did he have to fear? And that's the same way for us today. We do not need to cower in fear and reject the things that God has for us. We can press on faithfully for what the Lord has for us. Another question that we can have during this time is that Daniel was most likely more than 80 years old. And we can ask the question, how does this age of Daniel really reflect his faithfulness to God? And one can be, we'd see that one can be faithful to God regardless of their age. So many times I've seen young people afraid to step up and take charge and to take roles. Or I see old people, that's a bad way to say it. I see the older generation, oh man. I see the older generation who kind of gets to their end of their life and they kind of sometimes have to step back from more rigorous activities or rigorous ministries, and they sometimes lose their purpose in the world. And I've seen so many people, as they age, they transition to some ministries that may be more physically demanding or may just require too much time and energy, and they turn towards things that they can be faithful and they do not lose their faithfulness. This past time through this coronavirus, I've talked to many of our older ladies who have a card ministry where they send out cards and they minister to people that way, or they got all of our numbers from the church and they've just been calling and encouraging people during this time. Some of our amazing women who have been kind of sewing face masks during this time. There is so much that we can do, and I believe that God never calls us to retire from ministry. God always has a purpose, and we are to faithfully serve Him till the very end. And this is what Daniel is doing. He is serving the good fight until the very end. And as we kind of jump to the next section here, to Daniel chapter 6, verses 14 through 19, which says, "Then the king, when he had heard these words, was much distressed, and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king, and said to the king, 'Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians, that no injunction or ordinance that the king established can be changed.' Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, 'May your God whom you serve continually deliver you.' And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet, and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at daybreak the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions." See, here we find the plan of the satraps, of the officials of Daniel's enemy, at least to them at first, succeeds. Their plan is successful. And upon hearing this evil plan kindly come forward, the king becomes greatly displeased. He realizes that he's been tricked, he's been caught in a trap. It was never his desire to have one of his greatest leaders and servants be punished for the way that he worshipped. This wasn't a strong desire of the king. It wasn't something that he wished to happen. And he discovers that this true purpose was not to bring glory to him. It was not to unite the kingdom. It was simply a political move to remove Daniel from the picture. And what was actually the whole plan to begin with was to attack Daniel. And at this time, Darius had most likely become close friends with Daniel. Daniel was probably a close advisor, even to the point that the king begins to seek a way to deliver Daniel. The king is putting all of his effort. He has these sleepless nights. He is wanting to find a way to rescue Daniel. It says that he labored until the sun went down. And verse 15, they remind the king once again that the law of the Medes and the Persians cannot be changed. And I find this verse 15 really interesting. It just shows the difference between the power of a king, of a earthly man king, versus the power of God. What's interesting here is that what seems like, at least at first glance, ultimate authority that's given to a king is diminished when it is faced with public pressure. That even when the king wished to grant liberties and freedom to Daniel, he was unable to. And this just shows a king's power is heavily relied upon the willingness of his followers. If people are willing to follow you, you can have the power. If you lose the praise of the people, your power goes away really quickly. And especially when we compare it to God. See, there is a limit to the amount of human power that one man can achieve in comparison to the limitless power and authority that God holds. In verse 16, we see, having no choice, the king demands that Daniel is brought to be thrown into the den of lions. And this was one of the most drastic forms of punishment and mutilation imaginable, and it was a very common thing to be done by the Persians. They didn't go up and dig this den and put lions into it just for Daniel. This was a punishment that already existed. The lions needed fed again, and was something that occurred regularly. And to try to kind of describe this den for you, the lion's den most likely had two entrances. One entrance had a ramp that they would use to let the animals enter, and then the other opening would have been at the top of the den to throw prisoners and to throw food in and whatnot, so that the lions could eat. Whether the lions are eating a goat or a lamb, or whether the lions are eating a man, that's where it happened, from the very top. And what this was used for would be that the only way to escape would be to let down a rope. And this is why it was commonplace that to prevent escapes from happening, they would put a large boulder or rock over the entrance at the top, so that even if someone wanted to let down a rope to rescue someone, that they would have been unable. And it's even possible that this would have been a high enough hole in the roof that even if lions or animals weren't in there to eat someone, that just the fall alone could have drastically killed or maimed someone. Of course, the main purpose of this was not to kill them with the fall, it was to kill them with the lion. So it wasn't too high, of course. And once again, we see Daniel's devotion to God that had him convicted and thrown into the lions. He had the choice. He could have waited 30 days and gone back to praising God, but he chose to remain faithful. And what is amazing is that this pagan king who did not follow the God of the Hebrews, who did not follow the God of Israel, he spent sleepless nights praying and fasting that the one true God would rescue Daniel on his behalf. And while we don't have a prayer from Daniel, we definitely see this king acknowledging the one true God. And it kind of seems like this king was more concerned for Daniel's safety than Daniel was. It's like Daniel just knew that things were going to work out. That even if he dies, his life is in God's hands. And I think this is really because time and time again, Daniel saw God being faithful. And that's what living a life of faithfulness proves. It proves God worthy of our praise. It proves God worthy of our worship. It proves God worthy of our faithfulness. When we witness God blessing our life, we can be assured in what God has for us. And following that night, the king rushes to the den of lions to see what happens. So once again, reading verses 19 through the end, it says, "Then at break of day the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And as he came near the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, 'O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" I find verse 20 there very interesting. He asks, "Is your God, who you serve continually, able? Is your God able to deliver you?" Like, was this possible? And of course, we know saving Daniel from a den of lions is one of the least difficult things in God's repertoire. God did not have any struggle with this at all. But continuing, that Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all of their bones in pieces. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples and nations and languages that dwell in all the earth, "Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions." So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Verses 21 through 22, Daniel was alive and turned to the king. Why did Daniel claim to be innocent only after his salvation? That's one question that we can ask here. And I think there's a couple different answers. The first is, if he had claimed innocence before his execution, it could have been interpreted as fear or cowardness. We know that Jesus, even when confronted by Pilate, did not beg for his relief. He knew that he was innocent, but he did not plead innocence. He acknowledged the charges and kind of pressed on. Another answer is that it would not have helped anyway, because he has transgressed the law. Daniel knew that he broke the law that was put in place. He knew what would have happened. Despite being innocent before God, he knew that his kind of fate was set. And then finally, another question of why Daniel claimed to be innocent following this is that attempts to justify oneself in such a situation just kind of creates more problems. Once again, we saw Jesus did not justify himself either. Daniel just was willing to kind of get on with this. He knew God would, or he didn't know God would protect him, but he knew that he served a God who had all things in his hand. He was willing to trust in God rather than argue for his relief. And once again, Daniel attributes his salvation to God. Verse 23, his trust was rewarded. He was able to leave the lion's den unharmed because God was faithful. And this kind of really put a pinpoint in this. The wall that they kind of constructed is they never put a qualification that the prisoner being thrown into the pit had to die by lions. They just said he had to be thrown into the pit. So Daniel, after spending the night with the lions, he was able to go free because the law did not demand death. It only demanded punishment. And we see that whenever the king realizes and hears Daniel's voice, he is very glad and excited that his God, or the God of Daniel, rescued Daniel from the lions. He commands his release, and he has excitement. But we also see, following this time, the king's displeasure of what the law meant, that it only was invented and put in place to trap Daniel. And because of his kind of displeasure with his other, with the satraps and the other governing officials, because of his anger towards them of what they did to Daniel, the king commands that the men who maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, that their children and their wives would be cast in with them. And I find this incredibly, and just incredibly brutal. Like, not only are you being punished, but also your wives and your children go down with you. And though I find this exceptionally cruel, it was very commonplace at this time. I think it really goes down to there was this belief that this anger and this rebellion ran in families and not just rested with one person. It also really made you second guess going against the king. You know, sometimes we're willing to sacrifice our own life to get what we want, but are we willing to sacrifice the lives of those we love? You know, am I willing to go up against the government if I know that if I fail, not only is it my life, but it's also the life of my wife and my children? And that makes me rethink going against the king, and even prevents me, at least most of the time, especially if I love my wife and my kids. I'm not going to try to do something stupid to put them in danger. And because there was this threat that you could lose your family, also, the king has to kind of go through it. To prove that I'm willing to punish everyone you love, you're going to have to follow me. And this is exactly what happens. And once again, we see this miracle in Daniel's rescue, that, you know, even though Daniel escaped unharmed and that the lions had their mouths shut all night long, the moment these other men and their families fall in, the lions kill them before they even hit the ground. These lions were hungry and ready to feast, and yet they still did not harm Daniel. And that just shows the miraculousness of what happened. So looking at the final verses, we see that just as King Nebuchadnezzar before him, Darius gives a decree to every people, every nation, every language, praising the living God. And I find this phrase here, living God, really interesting. It's as if they know that their gods are dead and that this God is living, that there is something different. That's the God of Israel, the God of Daniel. He is living and eternal. He is sovereign, all powerful. He is able to deliver his people. And nevertheless, it is even though Darius kind of gives these praises, God, is unlikely that he ever came into a saving faith, because he really only would have accepted God of Israel as just one of the many gods. Remember, we serve a jealous God who wants all authority and all praise devoted to him. The God of the Bible is not okay with us worshiping him and worshiping other gods. He wants our full attention, and this is probably something that Darius never gave. And though I hope and pray for everyone throughout all of history that all would come to saving faith in Christ, and at least for Darius, the future sacrifice of Christ and devoted to the one true God, it's very unlikely that Darius actually had a saving faith here. He just witnessed this great, amazing miracle, and he understood that this, of all the gods that I know of, this God is real and this God is living. And I think that's an amazing thing to see a pagan king worshiping God. Even if he doesn't worship God alone, he is still worshiping God. And as we kind of come to a close today, let's just remember that we serve a God who is able to deliver us. He is able to answer our problems. He is able to answer our cries. And sometimes our faith is going to get us in trouble. Sometimes our faith is going to get us persecution, and even in this case, the threat of death. But serving God is greater than the risk. Serving God is worth our lives. And that is what we hope for, and that is what we strive for today. And I use people like Daniel in the Bible as a huge inspiration for my life. I know that I am sinful. I know that I'm imperfect. But I kind of look at it as, if I can be more like Daniel today, what will that prove? What will that accomplish in my life? What greater things could I do because of that? Will I receive more of God's blessing? Will I be able to accomplish more? Will I be able to lead more people to Christ with that type of faith? And that's why we research the scriptures, to gain inspiration, to gain examples that we could follow. So I just want to encourage you today that continue to search your faith, continue to seek after God. If you are at our church and at Durham Baptist next week, we're going to be really dive into what does it mean to be obedient to the authority that God has placed before us. What does it mean to be obedient and devoted to our government? Should we follow the government over God? I think this example here shows us no. But there are a lot of different intricacies to this question. I'm really looking forward to Sunday, and I'm praying for you all, and I hope you all have a great week. We will see you next time.